Hi everybody, I'm Amanda Garcia, a lecturer in the Digital Assets Group in the Faculty of Mathematics.
And I'm Giuseppe Sellaroli. I am a Psi Fellow at Perimeter Institute and I'm adjunct faculty in Applied Mathematics. Today we're going to tell you about a study that we did about using comics in the first year linear algebra course.
This project was funded by a Learning, Innovation, and Teaching Enhancement Grant awarded by the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Waterloo. So this was a light grant project, and our team included Dan Walchuk from the Faculty of Mathematics. Dan was the principal investigator. Jocelyn Go and Sophie Hay from the University Statistical Consulting and Collaborative Research Unit. They did all the data analysis for us. And in addition to designing the study, Giuseppe and I wrote the comics, and Giuseppe did the illustrations. Pour ce projet, nous avions deux objectifs principaux. En premier lieu, nous voulions évaluer l'impact que pouvaient avoir les bandes dessinées, ou BD, dans le cadre d'un cours de mathématiques de premier cycle. Deuxièmement, nous voulions contribuer à la littérature sur l'usage des BD dans les cours de mathématiques au niveau universitaire. Dans nos recherches, nous avons trouvé plusieurs études portant sur les BD à l'université dans le domaine de biologie, de business et de médecine pour en nommer quelques-uns. Par contre, il y avait très peu d'études portant sur les mathématiques. Nous aimerions donc contribuer au corpus de recherche à cet égard. L'étude a été menée dans un cours d'algèbre linéaire de première année durant l'hiver de 2019. Nous avions comme sujet environ 1200 étudiants divisés en 9 sections. Sur l'écran, on voit les trois personnages principaux des BD. Un ours polaire qui s'appelle Paula et les pingouins jumelles Penny et Gwen. Nous avons choisi des animaux plutôt que des humains comme personnages pour des raisons d'inclusion, mais aussi parce qu'ils sont mignons. Les BD étaient distribués selon un horaire plus ou moins hebdomadaire qui comprenait des pauses pour la semaine de lecture et pour les examens finaux. Le vendredi, une BD portant sur le matériel appris durant la semaine était affichée. En tout, nous avons créé 8 BD adaptés au cours, portant sur des sujets avec lesquels les étudiants et les étudiantes ont souvent des difficultés. Nous avons couvert les ensembles générateurs, le système d'équations linéaires, une revue pour l'examen mi-session, les transformations linéaires, les espaces vectoriels, le changement de base, l'histoire des matrices et le déterminant.
We had 3 different formats for the comics. I'm going to briefly describe each one of them. The first one is what we called Two Penguins and a Bear. Of course, they are the 2 penguins and a bear that you saw in the previous slide. And the idea here, the setup is that we have some kind of show. We thought of this as some YouTube channel named Two Penguins and a Bear, in which Paula, Penny, and Gwen teach linear algebra to their audience. In this particular example, you can even see here Joe the camera penguin, who's the one doing the recordings. And in this particular example that you can see here, we are showing the vector spaces comic. In this comic, our trio is teaching vector spaces, and to do this, they use as an analogy the abstract concept of a penguin, and they compare that with the different species of penguins, and they use this as an analogy for the abstract concept of a vector space versus the various specific examples of vector spaces. This is the format that we use for most of the comics, 6 out of 8. The second format was a one-shot that we did just for the midterm review comic. In this comic, we have a flashback of Penny and Gwen in the university days, and they are discussing ways to prepare for their own linear algebra exam. The goal here is to teach students about concept maps by having one of the penguins teach the other one about these concept maps because they didn't know about them before. But also we wanted to portray these penguins as actually being students. And so they are studying for the exam, one of them is struggling, they have stuff to do, and it's stressful. The last format is what we call a brief history of. We use this format just once at the end to give a comic about the history of matrices. We didn't use a regular cast for this comic, but instead we have an unseen narrator, and we have comic version of the relevant figures appearing in the comic. So for example, here you can see Seki Takakazu, a Japanese mathematician, who among the other things introduced determinants well before European mathematicians. We decided to do this comic because we felt it would be beneficial for the students to learn that mathematical ideas take centuries to get to the shape they learn in their courses, while they usually just get to see the finished product.
Nous avons recueilli nos données en suivant 3 méthodes. D'abord, les étudiants devaient compléter des questionnaires pré- et post-BD. Les questions portaient sur le niveau de confiance avec le matériel de la BD avant et après leur lecture. Vers la fin du cours, nous avons distribué un questionnaire plus long, environ 30 questions, visant à comprendre comment les BD ont contribué à la participation, aux attitudes, à la motivation et à la compréhension des étudiants et étudiantes. Enfin, nous avons formé 2 groupes de discussion pour donner la chance aux élèves d'approfondir leurs commentaires. So I'm going to share a portion of the survey data that we collected. So from the short survey, the big takeaway was that the comics were useful to students, regardless of their level of understanding of the course material. So I'm going to walk us through this particular chart. So on the x-axis, in some sense, we're measuring how confident a student was with the material before they read the comic. So they were either not at all confident, a little confident, neutral, somewhat confident, or very confident. And within each of these buckets, each color gives the students answer to the follow-up question about whether the comic was helpful. So they could answer no, somewhat, or yes. So just as an example, if we're reading the leftmost set of bars, out of the students who were not at all confident with the material before reading the comic, around 30% answered that yes, the comics were helpful. More than half answered that the comics were somewhat helpful, and the rest found that the comics were not helpful. So overall, 60% of the students did report a better understanding of material after reading the comics. And also 26% reported much better understanding, and this was regardless of their confidence level in the material before reading the comics. So this was an indication to us that the comics are actually useful to students, and in particular students who have varying levels of understanding of the course material. So we're getting students at various levels of understanding, kind of regardless of where they're at. When we asked students about whether the comics helped them feel engaged in the course, 81% of them reported that at least half of the comics helped, and 48% answered either agree or strongly agree. So I just want to note here that when we're reading these charts, usually the strongly disagree will correspond to something like none of the comics. The middle option will correspond to something like half of the comics, and on the strongly agree, we have all of the comics. So for example, in this case, strongly disagree means that none of the comics helped the student feel engaged. In the middle, we have about half of the comics help the student feel engaged. And on the strongly agree, we're saying that all of the comics help the student feel engaged. So just remember that the strongly agree bar is actually set quite high for our study.
The next question was whether the comics made the course more interesting to the students. You can see that there's a similar distribution here. It's again skewed towards agree. And in this case, we have 70% of the students reporting that at least half of the comics made the course more interesting to them, and 44% are in the agree or strongly agree answers, which means it's either going to be more than half of the comics to all of the comics, making the course more interesting. The next question was about whether the comics improved their attitude toward the course. Now you can see that here and also in some other of the charts, this is more skewed towards neutral, which may sound bad, but it's actually not a bad thing at all, because remember the neutral here just means that there is some improvement in some topics. Strongly agree again is a very high bar. We don't really expect to get that because that will mean that we improved absolutely everything with comics. So in this particular case, we have 74% of the students reporting that their attitude improved at least in some topics, which is great, with 30% in the agree and strongly agree buckets. And then we even asked whether these comics improved their attitude towards mathematics courses in general offered at the University of Waterloo. Again, there's a similar distribution to what we had before, and it's peaked on neutral, which again means that there were improvements in some mathematics courses. So even courses that were not actually related to the comics, somehow their attitude improved. And there's a couple of students who strongly agreed, which means that there were improvements in all mathematics courses at the University of Waterloo, which is great to hear.
So with respect to motivation, 62% of the students reported that the comics motivated them to study at least half of the course material, and 29 reported that the comics motivated them to study more than half to all of the course material. And when it came to helping with overall understanding of the material, 71% of them reported that the comics provided at least some help in their overall understanding, and 38% either agreed or strongly agree with that statement. So in other words, the comics provided great help in understanding the material, or somewhere between some and great help. And finally, we asked students about whether they would like to see similar comics in other first-year mathematics courses. So 51% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, and this was a good indication to us that the comics were generally well received by the students.
We should point out that there are a few limitations with the data we presented. First of all, despite the reasonably large cohort, which was 1,200 students, the sample size for the surveys was relatively small. In particular, for the short surveys, the response rate varied throughout the term considerably, so the responses started declining as the term progressed. And finally, it should be kept in mind that the data consists of students' self-reports of their own perceptions. So we had questions about whether the comics improved their attitude or their understanding. And these are just questions of whether they felt these improvements. We didn't have any external measures by which to compare these statements. So this is something that we want to keep in mind for the future. And finally, we'd like to talk about the next steps for this research once the world goes back to normal. First, we're planning to submit our findings for publication, and we are planning to eventually run a follow-up study. So keep some of the ideas of what we had, but try to improve on, for example, the limitations I talked about in the previous slide. Some of the things we would like to add are analytics. We considered doing something like this originally, but in the end, we were not able to implement it. So we'll try to do this again. And we are going to look for ways to increase the response rate in order to actually get more useful statistics.
Merci bien pour votre présence aujourd'hui. Nous sommes reconnaissants à la Société pour l'avancement de la pédagogie dans l'enseignement supérieur pour avoir organisé ce non-congrès. Nous tenons aussi à remercier le Center for Teaching Excellence pour le financement de notre étude. Nous espérons échanger virtuellement avec vous bientôt. Thanks for attending this talk, and a special thank you to the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education for organizing this year's unconference. We would also like to thank the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Waterloo for funding our study. We look forward to connecting with you virtually.